Okay. Thank you so much, Jane, for the kind introduction. And hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. For me, it's really a great pleasure to be here, especially since, as Jane said, I worked here myself several years ago. What I will present to you in this talk are basically the findings from a 5-year research project that was funded by the Research Council of Norway, and it goes under the acronym WATREC for Wage Regulation. And in a way, by being here, I feel like I'm coming full circle because I'm pretty sure I had the first ideas for this project while sitting here on the first floor in a nice office over there with a view on Wellington Square. I think it's the office that Marek now has. Then, of course, it took a little while until the project could get started. And now the project formally finished in just a month ago. Obviously, many of the papers are still in progress. Let me just switch on my timer here. So it's not fully wrapped up, but it is sort of in the finishing phase, and so it's very nice to be here and present these results. I will present an overview of the findings. That means I cannot go into all the empirical details, but if necessary, we can get back to that in Q&A. And I take this talk also for me as an opportunity to rethink what we've done, to try to take a step back, maybe try out also slightly new perspectives on what we have been doing. So your feedback is still very welcome. As I said, not all the papers are published, and I also have this this kind of bold, scary idea of still writing a book to wrap up these findings. Also, I want to mention that what I present here is teamwork. So the team of this project, this WATREC project, I will not mention this all the time during the talk because it kind of disturbs the flow of the talk, but there was a postdoc and a PhD student and a research assistant and several co-authors involved, and you will see them in the references in the end. So the original motivation for this talk was this observation that there's so much economics research on minimum wages, but so little research on the politics. That was really the original motivation. But then I realized, well, but if I'm going to do research about minimum wages, you cannot really do that without talking about collective bargaining as well. And also indirect benefits are, I would argue, a very important policy in this context. And more generally, I then felt, taking a starting point from statutory minimum wages, I got interested into how states intervene in wage setting more generally, but applied then in particular to low wage employment. So let me start with this question, so why do we need minimum wages? Some of you might think that actually we don't need minimum wages. That's also okay. But if you have to come up with a justification of minimum wages in a normative way, what would you suggest? Any proposals? What's the best justification, the best reason why we should have minimum wages?
So employers don't exploit.
Okay, to prevent exploitation. Yeah, very good. Anything else?
Decent standards of living.
Sorry?
To guarantee decent standards of living to workers.
Decent standards of living, yeah, okay.
Them highest in Sweden, maybe Norway, we crowd out the we crowd out the bad jobs.
Okay, crowd out bad jobs, yeah, very good.
Recognize the value of different types of jobs.
Recognizing value, yeah, very good, I like that. Okay, so these are all what you mentioned, all debates, arguments in this debate, and are all relevant if you want to justify minimum wages. However, I teamed up with a political philosopher from Manchester, Christian Schemmel, and we wrote a basically philosophical paper about this. And we built a slightly different argument because most of the arguments that you have mentioned, there are also other policy tools that we can use for that purpose, for living standards, for example, also social benefits, or in-work benefits. So our argument is that it's a question of respect. We need minimum wages to pay respect to those people who are contributing to the social cooperation through paid work. Now, before anyone like Mary, no, I mean, what I was referring to before anyone gets upset with me about, well, what about unpaid work? This is just one way of contributing to the social cooperation. So we say paid work is a way of contributing, and the fact that people are there and contributing, that should be respected, and the minimum wage is a good way to pay that respect. So the state regulates and forces employers to pay at least a certain minimum. And actually this notion of respect in relation to the duty to contribute implies a notion that we know from the citizenship discussion, and which I guess most people here know, the citizenship rights from civic rights to political rights to social rights. And here we find a very similar notion that on one hand, the duty to contribute, on the other hand, then a right, an entitlement that goes along with this. So we then also propose this notion of economic citizenship. So, but when I talk about minimum wages, also in this normative context, it's important to keep in mind that minimum wages can be set in two ways. They can be set by law, what we call statutory minimum wages, or in collective bargaining, because collective agreements define the wages for all workers, including the least skilled workers. And so collective agreements normally automatically set what is the permissible minimum in their field of application. So these two policies, they set a wage floor below which wages are not legal. But then there's an alternative approach, which would be, okay, well, we can also accept that they are low wages, but we try to help the workers on these low wages by paying them something on top from the state budget. And that's the approach through in-work benefits. Although, of course, the history of in-work benefits is complex. They partly come from the history of family benefits. They are orientated towards poverty and in-work poverty. So it's a more complex tool. It's not just directed at wages, but still it matters here in this context. So these are the three policies that we were interested in this project. But since we're interested in state measures regarding collective bargaining, we're interested in what the state does to support collective bargaining. So that's the policy here. So then, as a first step of this project, we set out to measure the variation of these policies. So here again, we find the three main policies, and in the bullet points, the measures that we used. For statutory minimum wages, their level and the institutions to set these levels. For state support for collective bargaining, it's important to make a conceptual distinction between two types of support. The first type of support is support for the organizational conditions of collective bargaining. So basically to support the collective industrial organizations, and especially unions, who are the ones you can kind of count on in pushing for collective bargaining. Whereas the other approach are the statutory extensions of collective agreements. This is when collective bargaining has taken place, and then the state comes and says that since bargaining coverage is normally limited by the reach of the membership of the organizations that participate, in many cases, especially in continental Europe, then the state steps in and says, well, we're going to extend this agreement to the rest of the sector by the force of the law. But this is very different because this is, as it were, ex post, after the bargaining has taken place. So it doesn't really support, at least that's my perspective on it, doesn't really support the strength of the bargaining itself. And then in-work benefits, here we've done some innovative empirical work in creating a measure of tax benefit generosity for low-earning households, which comprises basically the whole range of benefits and tax measures that can be relevant for these households for two different household types. And we've hand-coded for all the countries involved, around 33 OECD countries, and since 2001, whether they have a dedicated in-work benefit scheme. So So then we applied confirmatory factor analysis in order to create composite measures of these three policies that we are interested in. And actually, so these first three measures here, they were not empirically relevant, so they were then dropped from the analysis. And also in this part of the project, we actually bracketed, so we kind of, from this part, we excluded the statutory extensions. That's based on the arguments that I've referred to. That's a more ex post measure. It's actually in some ways a little bit similar to statutory minimum wages. It's a decision that can be debated, but that's how it is. So then here's what we find. First, looking just at statutory minimum wages on the vertical axis and support for the organizational conditions of collective bargaining on the horizontal axis. And this is, we think, a really quite striking finding, because you see immediately that basically countries are aligned on one axis, and they sort themselves into these two corners, into these two alternatives. So in the top left, we have the countries that have well-established statutory minimum wages, and on the bottom right, we have the countries that emphasize statutory, support for collective bargaining. And also what I find particularly interesting about this finding is that we don't really find any countries in the bottom left quadrant. So you could think that as support for collective bargaining declines, in principle, there could be also nothing happening, you know, but that's not what we see. We see always one or the other way of setting a wage floor. Let me also briefly explain the scale. It's similar on the next figure. These are the factor scores, so they don't really have a substantive meaning. The value of 0 is the mean score. So then, since they are aligned on the same dimension, we actually merge these two measures into one measure, which in this figure is on the vertical axis, which we then call stateness of the wage floor, where the countries at the bottom emphasize this support for collective bargaining, and the countries at the top have well-established statutory minimum wages, but not so much support for collective bargaining. And now here we have on the horizontal axis also the third policy, in-work benefits. And we identify here three clusters of countries. In the bottom left, we call this wage scale protection, because it protects not only the workers at the minimum, but also the other workers at higher wage rates are protected through collective bargaining. In the top left, we have bare minimum, because there's just the minimum wage. And in the top right, we call that state pay, to emphasize that the state is here basically paying part of the income of these lower earning workers. And note also the overall distribution, which shows you that we have in-work benefit, well-developed in-work benefits only in countries that also have a statutory minimum wage. So then we looked also a little bit into the trends over time in these policies, and we find that basically on the vertical axis, there's a tendency of countries to move up, so away from state support for collective bargaining and towards statutory minimum wages. And on the horizontal axis, there's a less clear cut, but also a slight tendency for countries to move towards the right, so towards in-work benefits. And further, then we also looked into what's the effectiveness of these policy approaches, both in a descriptive way, but also with a panel regression analysis. I should say we don't have like strictly speaking, a causal design here, but still a panel regression design. And what we find is that this approach for wage scale protection is the most effective. There, low wage employment, the incidence of low wage employment is the lowest. The second sort of less effective, but still relatively effective approach is bare minimum. There, a lot depends on the actual level of the minimum wage. So basically having just a statutory minimum wage as opposed to good collective bargaining is worse. Oh, no. This is what Jane warned me I should not do. So it's worse to just have a statutory minimum wage, unless, of course, that minimum wage is high enough, then it still makes a difference. And quite clearly, the worst approach in terms of that you find most low-wage employment is the one with the in-work benefits. So, so basically, we find that countries are moving from the most effective in the direction of the less effective policy approaches. And of course, there are some other tendencies. We also see that actually there is a tendency of minimum wages to rise. And also recently there was the EU directive on adequate minimum wages, which goes into the right direction by calling for basically securing adequate minimum wage levels and improving collective bargaining coverage. But still the overall sort of historical trend is the one I mentioned. Yeah. So let's just have this sort of interim recap. Where do we stand? I showed you what, from our point of view, is the best justification of minimum wages. It's about respect. I showed you the policy variation, cross-sectional. Keep in mind this inverted L shape. And over time, it moves from more effective to less effective policies. Now, this then brings us to two puzzles. The first puzzle is, so why are policies moving from what works better to what works worse? And the second puzzle is, why is it that actually all countries tend to at least have some kind of policy for establishing a wage floor? And with these two puzzles in mind, let me move on to politics. So first, the politics of statutory minimum wages. First, a little bit more about what is going on here. So we see, and I'll show you more on this in the next slide, we see that more and more states introduce statutory minimum wages. We also see that across, well, all in all, minimum wages tend to rise. And we also see more and more cases of really salient politics of the minimum wage. Examples that come easily to mind are the UK, not least, where in 2015, the Conservatives actually politicized the minimum wage, decided to really boost it. The US, where there is a public campaign to lift the federal minimum wage, and there was an electoral promise by Joe Biden. In Germany, there's a public row about institutions to adjust minimum wage levels. In Spain, there was a high-profile lifting of the minimum wage. Similarly, in Poland, your colleague Marek wrote an excellent paper about the politics of the minimum wage in Poland and in Hungary. And in Italy, there's a public debate about introducing statutory minimum wage. So there's really quite a lot going on here. So showing you a bit more about the history of the minimum wage. The first, as I would say, true adopter of a statutory national minimum wage were the United States with the Fair Labor Standards Act in the New Deal era in 1938. You may ask whether also Australia, New Zealand, and UK should be in this category. They also had early forms of minimum wage legislation. However, they were not a law that really established one wage floor across the country. They had these in UK, it was called the trade boards. In Australia, it was called the wage council. So slightly different policies that establish more flexible sectoral minimum wages in specific sectors. Then we have some countries that adopted minimum wages under authoritarian regimes, Greece and Spain. We had some countries that adopted minimum wages in the transition from fascism to democracy. Basically, all the Central and Eastern European countries that we looked into have adopted the statutory minimum wage in their transition to capitalism and democracy. And then we have this long list of countries in the post-war era that adopted the minimum wage under democratic politics, and these are the ones that are most interesting for our research. And it's a really kind of striking trickle over the decades. You find at least between 1 and 3 minimum wage introductions per decade. And then finally, we have the countries that never adopted the statutory minimum wage. Here we have the Nordic countries, as well as Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. But actually, all of these three, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy, had at least a sort of a serious attempt or an ongoing debate to introduce a statutory minimum wage. So in a certain sense, you can say the Nordic countries are the only ones, the only sort of holdouts that are outside of this policy. So then, sorry, just briefly. So these are our cases of interest. Who introduced and why did they introduce statutory minimum wages? And we have collected a data set that starts at 1960. So basically all of these countries are the countries that we're covering, plus the not adopting countries as control group, as it were. And so we ran an event history analysis on this data, which included a time trend variable, the bargaining coverage in the previous year, the use of bargaining extensions in the previous year, which we need both because it can be a functional equivalent, but also because bargaining coverage includes workers that are covered due to the effect of extensions. There's no way to have any other data, so we need that also for that reason. Participation of left parties in government, whether there is left competition, defined as having more than one relevant left-wing party in parliament, effective number of parties, which we use as a proxy for political institutions, unemployment, the share of employment in the service sector, government consumption, which we use as a measure of the size of the public sector, actually mostly because we wanted to have a measure of public employment, and the public employment data was not good enough in terms of time series, trade openness, and then we also run an interaction effect. So this is the basic model, and what we did is also because of the nature of the analysis with a binary dependent variable, we ran at first the complete model, and then we dropped the control variables that were insignificant and did not and are not of theoretical interest to us. And so you can see very clearly that bargaining coverage has a strong effect. So basically, low bargaining coverage, or actually arguably it should be interpreted as declining bargaining coverage, increases the probability of introducing a statutory minimum wage. Left government is not significant in this baseline model, but also not of particular interest to us that trade openness tends to have an effect. This would be in line with what I guess you guys know as the compensation hypothesis in the globalization debate. So then as a next step, we introduce an interaction effect between bargaining coverage and left government. And indeed, that turns out significant. And then also the constitutive term for left government becomes significant. And let me just immediately show you the plot for this. So this shows you, and it's actually very intuitive, that so the effect of left partisanship in government is only there when there's low bargaining coverage. And this completely makes sense. First of all, when there's high bargaining coverage, you don't really need a statutory minimum wage. But maybe more relevant in this context, when there's high bargaining coverage, then unions don't want a minimum wage. And since left parties are often aligned with union preferences, then the left parties don't want it either. But when bargaining coverage is low, then it is the left-wing parties who act on this and introduce a statutory minimum wage. Now, this is the main story here, but it's not the full story, actually, when you look at the data more closely. For example, then we were wondering, like, well, but what about Netherlands and Belgium? When they introduced minimum wages, they had high bargaining coverage, and they had low participation of left-wing parties in government. So we looked a little bit more into it. We found that, you know, in the case study literature, we found that preceding the introduction of minimum wages, there were some conflicts in industrial relations or dysfunctions. These in turn seem to be related to high inflation. And we also saw that Christian democratic parties were leading those governments at the time of introducing the minimum wages. So based on this case information, we then, but this is really case, still work in progress, I should say, we ran a QCA. And we find two paths to introducing statutory minimum wages. First, the one basically confirming the findings from the regression analysis that the main driver is low bargaining coverage, but especially in relation together with left-wing governments. And we find another path where indeed high inflation is an important structural driver, but together with Christian democratic parties acting on this. And this covers indeed Netherlands, Belgium, and Slovenia. By the way, I wrote here also CNA. Has anyone of you heard about CNA, coincidence analysis? Okay, that's a pretty new method. It's very similar to QCA, but it uses a different algorithm, which they argue is better. So we try out this method in this paper as well, along with QCA. Right, moving on to levels. This shows you the empirical distribution. By eyeballing this, you can quite easily see that there is a tendency of rising minimum wage levels adjusted for inflation. Of course, there are exceptions. The US is a well-known case where the federal minimum wage stagnates and then goes down in real terms. Greece also, you can clearly see here the effect of the euro crisis. Other countries might be more of a ceiling effect, maybe in Belgium, but most countries have an upward. So what about explaining changes in levels? Here we ran a fixed effects panel regression, and this time I will spare you a big regression table. But we do find indeed that left-wing governments raise minimum wages more often than other parties. And we find in addition that this effect is particularly clear when the government actually has institutional control over the level setting. Because, and this is shown in this graph, because there are different institutions that regulate, or rules that regulate how minimum wages can be adjusted over time. And often this is kind of delegated to the social partners. But as we show here, in those cases where the government has control, we find the partisan effect. It's very intuitive, but still it's a finding that has never been shown before because there's so little literature on this. So then again, recapping this, this section on the politics of the minimum wage, introducing minimum wages, there's a structural determinant, which is the decline in collective bargaining. And then in particular, when this goes along with left-wing government, that's the most important explanation of that. And for the minimum wage levels, there's a political determinant, which are the left-wing governments, and they are in particular effective when they actually have government control over the levels as an institutional factor. So what about the politics of in-work benefits? This, I think, the only paper that I draw on here in which I was not a direct contributor. So this is work by Siri Petersen and John Abbas, who were members on this project. And first of all, they point out that what partisan effects to expect for in-work benefits is theoretically pretty ambiguous. And also Tim here has shown this in a nice case study that he wrote several years ago about the politics of in-work benefits in France. But running a panel regression analysis, they find that In fact, it is right-wing governments who expand in-work benefits more often. And for left-wing governments, they find an interesting interaction effect again with bargaining coverage. They find that left-wing governments are especially reluctant about in-work benefits when bargaining coverage is high, and only when bargaining coverage is low, then in a way there's a chance for them to act also in in-work benefits, which again makes sense, because if you have well-functioning collective bargaining, there shouldn't really be a need for in-work benefits. It's the ambition of unions that workers don't need state help for a decent living standard. A decent living standard should be guaranteed through the wages that they bargain for. For the politics of state support for collective bargaining, we have only conducted this type of analysis for statutory extensions, not for the other measures. One finding here is again that left-wing governments are more like, well, when you have a left-wing government, there's more use of the statutory extensions. Another aspect here is for unions, where again, unions are a bit ambiguous about this, about extensions, because they think if the government extends our collective agreement, it basically creates a free rider effect. People get to benefit from our agreement without being members of our organizations. But of course, it's also kind of nice for them. It gives them leverage. It increases the reach of collective agreements. And in line with the latter aspect, we find that indeed higher union density is associated with more use of statutory extensions, but not at a very high level. So in the countries where you have very high union density, this no longer holds, which makes sense. If unions are successful in collective bargaining, then they actually don't want the state to interfere with them. So then we also conducted 2 case studies, one on UK and one on Norway. I'm of course a bit apprehensive to talk to this audience about the United Kingdom, especially because we had a kind of broad sweeping approach here, tracing these 3 policies basically since the Thatcher era. So we started indeed with the deregulation of collective bargaining and of union power under Margaret Thatcher as kind of the initial point of this process. And we were interested in the consequences and the reactions to that. And so we find that, first of all, there was, in a way, kind of a mechanical response to this, that the dismantling of collective bargaining created more need, and hence also to some extent more spending on social benefits. But then also still under Thatcher, the family credit was introduced as a certain policy response. But this was all at a pretty low level. But then New Labour came into power, and they, of course, introduced the national minimum wage and the working families tax credit, which then became the working tax credit. And that was really a very substantial policy. It massively increased the spending on in-work benefits. And then the Conservatives, as already mentioned, in 2015 introduced what they call the national living wage. So significantly set the statutory minimum wage on an upward trajectory, but at the same time had the ambition to scale back in-work benefits, and working tax credit was merged into the universal credit under rather restrictive conditions. So our interpretation of this is that collective bargaining was effectively replaced by statutory minimum wage and in-work benefit policies. And the reasons for this we see in electoral democracy, that it was, well, first of all, it was electoral democracy that gives New Labour the opportunity to step in and come in with new policies. But also in the particular dynamic that we see here. So in line with the electoral incentives that are created for the parties in Britain and their competition around the political center. So New Labour, of course, came to power not on the claim, so kind of rejecting the idea of turning back the wheel of history and going back to the support for collective bargaining, but rather they came and saying, we introduce modern and new policies, so appealing to the center. And indeed, they said in their program, for example, a minimum wage is something every modern industrial state has. You know, that's the way they try to sell it. And similarly, the conservatives, well, first they rejected the idea of the minimum wage, but then they found out that it actually kind of worked and wasn't so terrible. And it gave them a tool to present something also to working class voters. And a policy that does not have any significant effect really on public spending, whereas they maintain kind of their profile on in-work benefits because of the public spending implications. And then Norway, well, Norway has over the post-war period established sound state support for collective bargaining. But then in the process of European integration, as Norway was about to enter the European Economic Area and was debating entering the European Community, this was seen as a threat to the labor market by unions, as they expected a rise in labor immigration. And so unions demanded that the government should introduce protective measures against this possibility. And indeed, the government listened to them and in 1993 introduced a law to introduce statutory bargaining extensions. And this was under a left-wing government, but when later right-wing governments came into power, they did actually not reverse this policy. So we argue that under well-established corporatism and in particular left-wing government, the government listened to unions and protected collective bargaining in the face of a perceived external threat. Now, when we picked these countries, we didn't have in mind a particular leverage of a kind of small n comparison. We picked them because they are most different, but still, this is not the most different design because it doesn't have a similar outcome. But still, it's interesting to just juxtapose these two countries. So in the UK, we see an active dismantling of collective bargaining, in Norway, an active maintaining of collective bargaining. In the UK, we see as a reaction to this dismantling that collective bargaining is being replaced by statist policies. In Norway, we see as a reaction to a perceived external threat that the state sort of brings in a new measure to additionally protect collective bargaining. And in the UK, what we see as having facilitated that replacement in terms of policies, it's electoral democracy, whereas in Norway, what we see as having facilitated the maintenance of collective bargaining are the underlying structures of cooperative. So let's move towards conclusion. Just let me briefly remind you of these empirical distributions that I've shown to you that pose certain puzzles. The first puzzle was, why have policies moved from more to less effective in terms of countering low-wage employment? And first of all, of course, there's the decline in collective bargaining, which to some extent is exogenous. To some extent, it's because of structural reasons and not just political reasons. For example, the move towards a service economy. But then also actors updated their preferences in reaction to this. So what we see is as collective bargaining declines, left governments turn towards statutory minimum wages as a policy to adopt in this kind of situation. We also see that as collective bargaining declines, in-work benefits become more of an option for left-wing governments. Similarly, unions, their first preference is collective bargaining, but once sort of collective bargaining has eroded to a certain extent, they also start to advocate statutory minimum wages or bargaining extensions. Is this inevitable? Well, no, we don't think it is. It is possible to also maintain and protect collective bargaining, but it looks like this requires well-established underlying structures of corporatism. Possibly, I haven't really explored this idea so much yet. I got this literally yesterday while I was writing the presentation. Possibly a particular kind of corporatism, which we may call bottom-up corporatism. Colin Crouch sets this out in his book, Industrial Relations and European State Traditions, that the corporatism in the Nordic countries is actually of a different kind and of different historical origins than the one in continental Europe. In the Nordic countries, it was more created from the collective organizations, the unions and the employer associations, whereas in the Nordic countries, it was more initiated through the state. And this may play a role here. So those structures matters, but also intervening early, to prevent the erosion of collective bargaining. And then, of course, regarding in-work benefits, what facilitates the move towards in-work benefits, although they are not effective in preventing low-wage employment, is also the influence of right-wing parties. What about the other puzzle? Why is there always a wage floor policy? So we argue this is where electoral democracy matters, and it matters in two ways. The first is that just in general, in terms of creating electoral incentives for parties to react to a situation where through the erosion of collective bargaining, basically a hole opens up at the bottom of the labor market. And political parties have an incentive not to ignore this if they want to get elected. But more specifically, electoral democracy, of course, gives left-wing parties the opportunity to enter government, and they are more keen to actually do something about this, as we've seen in terms of adopting statutory minimum wages. But also unions, they also adapt their strategy when they see collective bargaining declining, that they then also advocate statutory minimum wages to replace the collective bargaining. So in a way, a kind of hopeful thought here could be that, well, perhaps also the fact that there always is a wage floor policy is because there's the underlying intuition that we capture in our normative argument that it's a matter of respect is perhaps also something that really that motivates not only actors but also voters. However, don't get me wrong, like I'm not such a naive functionalist to think that this plays out easily. It was just a thought here, referring it back to also the normative argument that I introduced to you. And so finally, let me finish on this kind of more grandish statement. We see that electoral democracy limits the liberalization of labor markets, but it does so by introducing solutions that are inferior to collective bargaining. And here are the references and the co-authors that I mentioned. Thank you very much.